On va démarrer, chers collègues. Bonjour.
So we're going to kick off. Good morning, everyone. The adoption of the minutes. If there are no comments, then we can adopt those. Second point, as usual, I'd like to remind you that this meeting is public and will be web streamed live. During this meeting, interpretation is provided in English, French, German, Italian, Greek, Spanish, Portuguese, Lithuanian, Hungarian, Polish, Slovak, and Romanian. We will also have interpretation in Serbian for the item on Serbia and Turkish for the one on Turkey. There will be only passive Romanian instead of Lithuanian. I would also like to inform you about the introduction of amendments for the draw opinion on the Jury Commission report on the proposal for directive as regards that certain sustainability reporting and due diligence obligations. The deadline for amendments is set on the 5th of June at 6 p.m. As usual for this kind of procedure, you will receive an email announcing the opening of the system for the introduction of your amendments. And finally, last week, the plenary adopted 3 urgent resolutions. One on the arrest and risk of execution of Tundu Lissu, president of Chadema, the main opposition party in Tanzania. The return of Ukrainian children forcibly transferred and deported by Russia, and the violation of religious freedom in Tibet. Point 3. In accordance with Rule 220 of Parliament's Rule of Procedure, the final minutes of the decisions of the DROA coordinators meetings of the 20th of March and 7th of April have been uploaded to the DROA intranet site, together with other documents of those meetings. The decisions will be attached to the minutes of today's meetings, and if there are no objections raised, the decisions are deemed approved. Adoption of minutes. I now suggest to adopt the minutes of the DROA Subcommittee meetings of the 27th and 28th of January 2025, 17th, 18th February 2025, 19th, 20th March 2025, and 7th and 8th of April 2025. If there are no comments on the minutes, then, in the absence of amendments, the minutes of these meetings may be approved. So now, colleagues, let's move on to point 5 of the agenda. The public hearing with the title Promoting International Humanitarian Law and International Human Rights Law in Conflict Zones and Fragile Context to Protect the Most Vulnerable. This has been jointly organised with the DEVI Committee. So I'm pleased to co-chair this hearing with the Permanent Rapporteur for Humanitarian Aid of DEVI, Leila Bachin. Colleagues, many of the European Parliament's resolutions, and more recently our annual report on human rights and democracy, underline our Parliament's determination to promote and uphold international humanitarian law and international human rights law in all aspects of its external and internal policy, on the basis of treaties and the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. It is our duty to reaffirm this commitment, especially in view of the violations that are taking place daily before our eyes. The examples of Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, and the DRC immediately come to mind. Over the years, we've approached the issue of international humanitarian law from various angles: responsibility or accountability, the fight against immunity, and reparation for victims. Today, we'll focus our attention on another equally fundamental aspect: the views of local actors and the specific efforts needed to ensure respect for international law on the ground in situations of conflict and fragile contexts. It is about reflecting together on human, legal and financial resources, training, follow-up, institutional frameworks, but also on the political courage needed to bring these principles to life in the most complicated situations on the ground. So today, we will hear valuable testimonies from frontline civil society actors and local communities who intervene in high-risk conflict contexts in different geographical areas, often risking their lives. Thank you all for participating in this discussion. And before moving on to the first panel, I will give the floor to the co-chair of this session, my colleague, the Standing Rapporteur of the DEVI Committee, Leila Bachin. You have the floor.
Dear co-chair, dear colleagues, dear panelists, also from my side, a warm welcome on behalf of the Development Committee. I am particularly pleased that we are debating this important topic jointly with the Subcommittee of Human Rights today. International humanitarian law and the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality and independence, which are so fundamental to effective humanitarian action, are under threat today. We see violations happening every day in so many places around the globe. This is not only a very real problem for humanitarian workers whose effectively safety and ability to work are at risk, but it also means that aid can sometimes not reach the most vulnerable populations for whom it is intended. In fragile contexts, the situation is even more complex as weak governance, ongoing conflicts, and the collapse of legal institutions create an environment where violations of international humanitarian law often occur with impunity. 2024 was the last year on record, with 281 humanitarian workers killed globally. This stronger humanitarian diplomacy, these numbers and the alarming trends underscore the urgent need for stronger humanitarian diplomacy and protection mechanisms, particularly in fragile settings where the humanitarian space continues to shrink. Today's hearing is therefore an important opportunity for us to take stock and discuss how the European Union can contribute to strengthening compliance with international humanitarian law and the protection of civilians, in particular the most vulnerable. I look forward to hearing from our experts about the complex challenges that are at stake. In particular, it would be interesting to get our experts' assessment about the complexities on the ground, on the challenges these represent to the European Union's and Member States' humanitarian advocacy today, benefiting from our speakers' direct experience dealing with concrete cases. With this in mind, I would like to ask all panelists how they think the European Union can become an even more effective actor in humanitarian diplomacy. I look forward to hearing the insights and recommendations from all our distinguished speakers. So with this, I now hand the floor back to my co-chair, Mr. Satori.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. I will now give the floor to the panelists. And we are fortunate enough to have them with us in the room today. It's a great pleasure for us to welcome Mr. Alain Délétroz, Managing Director of Geneva Call, and Mr. Atif Hameed, Director of Operations. I would like to thank you for contacting us on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of your organisation and congratulate you on the work done during these years. Geneva Call's mission is to strengthen the protection of civilians in armed conflict by promoting compliance with international humanitarian standards among armed non-state actors. We're also honoured to have with us Mr. Juan Carlos Villate Camargo, a human rights defender with extensive experience in community protection and mediation in conflict situations. You served as personero in the municipality of Dame in the department of Arauca in Colombia, where you connected local communities with armed groups or de facto authorities working to defend human rights at local level. We will then watch a video testimony which is presented to us by Geneva Call, in which Drabo Yakuba, National Coordinator of the Fraternity of the Pan-African Union of Dozers Without Borders in Burkina Faso, will share his experience on the ground respecting international humanitarian law. Finally, I will give the floor to Ms. Yvonne Agengo, Child Protection Officer at the International Rescue Committee, and she will focus on child protection given that children are among the first victims in conflict-affected areas. Once again, thank you all for being with us today. You have the floor. Chair, Co-President Rapporteur, I would like to thank you for inviting me here, MEPs, friends. It's a great pleasure for Geneva Call to be here with you today in order to discuss this crucial issue that we're experiencing right now, which is the respect for international humanitarian law. I'd like to thank the two parliamentary committees for organizing this session, and thank you for the words of introduction in which you've discussed the importance of respecting these basic standards which are at the heart of international law. You talked about our 25th anniversary, and I'd like to thank the DG ECHO and FPI in particular, given that we've been collaborating with them for many years. They have been supporting us financially on the ground as well. And whenever we've required political support, this has come from European ambassadors who have supported our work as well. And as you know, respect for international humanitarian law and human rights is crucial in order to protect civilians and facilitate aid in times of conflict. However, it's clear that persistent and systematic violations of international humanitarian law and human rights jeopardize the very foundations on which our multilateral system has been built for more than 80 years. According to the UN, OCHA, 2024 was the deadliest year for humanitarian workers since the creation of the UN. Non-compliance with international humanitarian law endangers the entire humanitarian system. It increases suffering and costs of operations, delays aid deliveries, and makes it more difficult to meet the basic needs of civilians in conflict zones. Against this alarming backdrop, the Geneva Call marks this year its 25th anniversary of our commitment to protect civilians in conflict zones outside state control. This is a commemoration that, far from being a celebration, pushes us towards reflecting in humility and renewed mobilization. In 2024, the ICRC estimated that there were more than 450 non-state armed groups in the world, which is a huge humanitarian concern. We estimate that over 210 million civilians live in areas outside state control. So these are areas where armed groups have created de facto authorities and manage or control the population. And this is further complicated by the increasing use by states of armed groups in their service. There isn't a single conflict in the world which isn't affected by this, which makes the promotion of international humanitarian law more difficult and humanitarian access more uncertain. Faced with this complexity, Geneva Call has chosen a more pragmatic approach. We've based our actions on the conviction that it's not only possible but necessary to engage with the AGDAs in order to promote their voluntary adherence to international humanitarian standards. And this necessary dialogue takes time. However, we've observed a lasting change in the behavior of armed groups that can help to reduce violence, often after several years of dialogue. It's by adopting creative tools that we can adapt to the reality of the actors and settings, such as our engagement acts or the unilateral declarations signed by actors. That leads to a commitment to positive behavioural change, and in 2024 Geneva Call's humanitarian engagement extended to more than 204 armed groups and de facto authorities. Geneva Call focuses in particular on the protection of women, children and marginalised groups. These are the groups that face increased risks in conflict areas with increased vulnerabilities that are related to factors such as age, gender, disability, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and gender identity. These cross-cutting elements significantly influence their exposure to discrimination, violence, including sexual violence, exploitation, and the exclusion of resources. Finally, let me highlight the dangers of anti-personnel mines. They kill and mutilate indiscriminately well after the fighting has ended. Their indiscriminate nature makes them even more unacceptable. They affect the most vulnerable just like any other civilian without distinction. And this scourge was at the very heart of the creation of Geneva Call in the wake of the Ottawa Convention 25 years ago. It is more urgent than ever to strengthen the standards of protection and combat the backsliding that we've observed, including in areas where we have a solid legacy. With regard to anti-personnel mines, we've done a lot of work here in Europe, and so we are therefore unequivocally calling for progress made in the past to be upheld and for the protection of human dignity to remain at the heart of the European Union's vision, including security. It's difficult to ask armed groups to comply with standards that member states aren't willing to follow. So now I'd like to give the floor to my colleague Atif Hameed, Director of Operations.
Dear Chair, dear members of the European Union Parliament and dear colleagues, based on and following up on what our Director General has said, currently Geneva Call is operating in 14 different armed conflict contexts, basically in different geographical areas. And through its well-designed programmatic interventions based on different conflict intensity models, Geneva Call is focusing on addressing protection of civilian issues through improving respect and compliance of international humanitarian law and international human rights law by armed groups and de facto authorities. Humanitarian engagement with UGDAs is done in coordination and collaboration with a broad ecosystem of local community actors, civil society leaders, and humanitarian stakeholders. Here, I would like to highlight a few concrete examples of the successful impact of Geneva Call's work in 2024. In specific, in advancing respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law in some of the world's most complex conflict settings. In DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, Geneva Call responded to 19 alerts in 2024 through 28 bilateral meetings, which led to 12 concrete measures enhancing compliance with international humanitarian law. These included the liberation of occupied schools, the release of civilians, including 3 humanitarian aid workers, and the dismantling of a number of checkpoints used for taxation and other purposes by armed groups. These efforts also contributed to the release of 46 children previously recruited by armed groups. In 2024, Geneva Call engaged a number of armed groups and de facto authorities on famine and food insecurity and on prevention of sexual violence and gender discrimination. And as a result, the armed groups have taken measures to respect compliance based on the implementation plan that is under process. In Sudan, through engagement with various armed groups, tribal leaders, Sudanese armed forces commanders, and a number of groups who are affiliated with RSF, Geneva Call improved humanitarian access and civilian protection in Darfur, Blue Nile, and Al Jazeera states. These efforts enabled the delivery of aid and medical supplies and helped safeguard civilian infrastructures such as markets, farmland, schools, and health facilities. Coming to Syria, in Syria, the 50-plus armed groups that participated in the military operation that led to the overthrow of Assad regime demonstrated with very few exceptions a strong commitment to international humanitarian law. From the control room when the forces were advancing to capture Damascus, during the military operation, key military leaders that Geneva Call trained issued military orders and public statements referencing the Geneva Convention, the protection of prisoners of war, and the safeguarding of civilian infrastructures. This conduct is evidence of the positive impact of Geneva Call's sustained humanitarian engagement for the last 10 years, and in this process we trained more than 45 of these armed groups on protection of civilians. While coming to the neighbor in Iraq, Geneva Call facilitated the return of our 50 families, which is approximately 250 individuals, to one of the most contested, difficult, hard-to-access areas in Jurful Sakhar, as well as 327 families to one of the disputed territories in Kirkuk. Geneva Call helped secure humanitarian access by enabling the removal of military barricades in the north of Iraq and easing checkpoints restrictions in one of the border areas of Amber. As a result, humanitarian actors were able to resume operations in armed group de facto authority control areas. Lastly, I would also like to say that there are multiple number of cases in Myanmar, in Afghanistan, in Burkina Faso, as well as in many other locations where Geneva Call teams have managed to engage armed groups on the release of child soldiers, protecting women and children, and ensuring compliance. On this note, I will now give the floor back to our Director General to highlight how the European Union institutions, and especially the European Parliament, would support the respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hameed. Geneva Call have formulated only 3 recommendations for the EU institutions. We don't want to go down a very long list, right? The first one is obvious, but sometimes it could go without saying, but it's always better in saying it. 1, reinforce humanitarian diplomacy to promote both international humanitarian law and the law of human rights, and safeguard humanitarian access. The EU can strengthen its humanitarian diplomacy by actively engaging in dialogue with conflict parties and state actors to promote compliance with these 2 bodies of law, international humanitarian law, law of human rights, thus bridging the gap between discourse and practice. This includes using its political leverage to demand respect for fundamental humanitarian norms of restraint in case of armed conflict, including the ban of anti-personnel mines, request unimpeded humanitarian access in crisis settings, and advocate for the protection of civilians, including the most vulnerable ones, and humanitarian spaces. The second recommendation for the institution is to invest in the protection and security of humanitarian aid workers. Mrs. Co-Chair gave a terrible statistic for 2024, 281 humanitarian workers killed. The EU could allocate increased resources to ensure the physical and legal protection of humanitarian personnel operating in high-risk environment. This includes support for training, security protocols, legal assistance. You know, one of the issues today is that humanitarian workers are not only facing the bullets in the conflict, the zone conflicts, but they might face judges when coming back because someone would say, oh, you've been working or talking to terrorists. So this legal protection for humanitarian workers is essential. And also diplomatic intervention in cases of targeting or criminalization of aid workers. We have, as I alluded to in my introduction, already been the beneficiary of such inputs by the diplomats of the European Union, and we encourage the EU to continue doing that. And the third recommendation is more directed to this Parliament, which we think that the recognition of the European Parliament's key role in expanding EU funding for humanitarian organizations must be taken seriously. The European Parliament can also assert its influence in advancing humanitarian and human rights principles, ensuring accountability in the EU external action. A robust and well-funded humanitarian development and peace nexus approach is needed for the EU to effectively address the complex challenges faced by partner countries of the EU. The EU as a whole must drastically increase financial support to impartial humanitarian actors. This issue of impartiality is also very much attacked in most of the armed conflicts of today. This idea that you can have impartial, neutral actors that must be capable of working the two sides of the lines. You take all the 6 biggest armed conflicts of today, this principle, which is an old principle dating back to the 19th century, is questioned very strongly today. So the EU and this Parliament can really raise its voice against it. It is essential to save lives that the impartiality and neutrality of humanitarian actors are accepted by all the sides. I think I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Monsieur Villat. Allez-y.
Mr. Villat, you have the floor.
Bueno, muy buenos días para...
Good morning, everyone. As was said when I was introduced, I'm Juan Carlos Villate Camargo. I would like to thank every one of you for allowing me to participate in this important forum. I have been working for a bit over 15 years on humanitarian issues linked to the presence of armed actors in different territories. And I have been doing this work in very complex sectors. Recently, in 2023 and 2024, the report on the UN Human Rights Office presented the Department of Arauca in Colombia, and particularly the municipality of Tamaruc, as one of the most violent ones. And that's where I have been working on human rights from a state perspective, representing state bodies. And here I'd like to talk about municipal bodies, institutions, which are the representation of human rights in the territory of international humanitarian law. And they play a fundamental role in acting against humanitarian violations by state and non-state bodies. Of course, this is a very challenging and difficult role, and it's being carried out in a context where the border and the relationship with other countries facilitates the presence of non-state armed forces, where illegal trade, natural resources, and even the presence of the border itself in this area exacerbates conflict and creates a more difficult situation in the territories. And so severe human rights violations in these territories are linked with forced child recruitment. We have reported this constantly, and even the same armed bodies have threatened me directly in Colombia. We have reported sexual assault of young girls in the territory, the significant number of persons who disappear, of displaced communities, internally displaced communities, of assassinations. And I'd like to say very clearly, although in 2016 Colombia signed a peace agreement with the FARC, and that was very positive for Colombia, and it brought humanitarian improvement to the territory. By 2019, there were new groups born of the FARC that existed before, and
Today, there is a significant humanitarian crisis in Colombia, and I wanted to lay that out before you so that you could understand that in Arauca, in Colombia, in Tamis municipality, we are seeing human rights violations in the framework of a very complex conflict because of the presence of non-state armed forces. There are many of them that have popped up, and the national Colombian government has tried, with the support of the international community, to launch peace talks. And unfortunately, these have not led to the humanitarian improvements that we hoped for. In 2022, there was a crisis due to confrontations between these illegal groups. And today in Colombia, groups like the LN, the state body that came from the FARC and other groups, they're killing each other and they're putting civilians in danger, and this creates a very complex and difficult humanitarian situation. This is what I wanted to bring to your awareness, honourable members of Parliament, and ask for your help with what's going on in Colombia. We thought and we were convinced that the peace process signed in 2016 in Colombia was going to bring the humanitarian results that we hoped for, but that wasn't the case. Today, the humanitarian crisis in Colombia is much worse than it was 50 years ago. The number of people who disappear, who are murdered, the number of children who are being recruited, the sexual violence, they are bringing our communities to their knees, and we've been doing everything we can to put an end to this. The non-state armed groups are making a mockery of the Colombian state. They have sat at tables talking about ceasefire, and they have taken advantage of the desire for peace to expand their territory and increase their illegal trade. Today, it's not easy for the Colombian state to fight these armed groups, and if the state is finding it hard to do this, imagine what the humanitarian situation looks like on the ground. It is a humanitarian situation that has led us to develop strategies, and this is based on the main premise of protection by presence, because in Colombia we have learned through experience that the worse the conflict gets, the more closed the communities become. The armed groups restrict access to humanitarian workers from different institutions to these communities, and we've learned from that experience, and today we are fighting to ensure our presence within the communities, protection through presence, and this is something that is upheld with the support of international organizations like Geneva Call. This is crucial, particularly when there's a risk of death. We have our own families, we have our children as well, and thanks to humanitarian organizations like Geneva Call, we have been given the strength to be present in the community when there are violent situations, and these types of things happen every day. But the more things escalate, the more the doors of access to these communities close. We need international cooperation to continue to access these communities. Territories which have no food security, where armed groups confine these communities, and this restricts, by restricting their mobility, it restricts the entry of goods and services, and that affects their food security, their access to health care, even their access to being able to do their daily chores. Water security doesn't exist, and that's where we need to help many communities, not just in Arauca, in Tami, in Colombia, but also in places like the north of Santander, Catatumbo, Chocoto, Putumayo. These are very critical areas that need special attention in the country. And today I have come from Colombia to ask you for your support. Things are going very badly right now in Colombia, despite the national government's will to change things. The armed groups are making a mockery of the government, and there is even more desolation and death day after day. I can tell you so many stories. Children who asked the armed groups I went and I asked them personally to return these children, and then I found out that they had died in combat. Children who are 11, 12, 13 years old, children who are, women who are being sexually exploited. This is, we have girls and children being taken out of their schools and homes today. So finally, if I can give a recommendation, well, I have two main recommendations that I can give to the European Union, and they go hand in hand with what Alan was talking to us about. The first is that we need diplomatic channels. Those recommendations that the European Parliament can make to Colombia to strengthen the monitoring and the tasks that the Colombian state undertakes to protect civilians. And secondly, we need to increase investment. Every day we see humanitarian actors leave the territory because they aren't being financed. There are not enough resources to strengthen their activity. So we need to be able to finance civilian protection projects, humanitarian safety projects, and that would make a significant impact in the territory for Geneva Call and other institutions. That's where I'll leave my speech off today. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. And now we'll start the video. We'll be watching a 3-minute video. For an introduction to the video, it's going to show you an armed group from Burkina Faso, which is a part of the Homeland Volunteers. And like what Mr. Camargo said, in Burkina Faso, there are many armed groups, and that has become a problem, and we have managed to arrive at a change of behavior, but there are many other groups in Burkina Faso who we're trying to work with, and that remains very difficult. Thank you. I am Drabo Yakuba Lubonk, and I am the national coordinator of the Brotherhood of the Pan-African Union of borderless Dozos in Burkina Faso. I coordinate the entire Dozo Brotherhood in Burkina Faso and in some sister countries in the sub-region. The Dozo Brotherhood is an organization of Dozo groups known as traditional hunters. And these traditional hunters were well organized to be able to make a contribution to social cohesion. But within this organization, within our community, we still lacked many elements. Because with the current safety context, although the communities were well organized, we were still unfamiliar with many of the issues we encounter today. Before we knew about international humanitarian law within our organization in the Dozo Brotherhood, we already had what we call Sharia law. And in Sharia law, there were prohibitions against using children in armed conflict. And for that reason, as is clearly enshrined in international humanitarian law within the Dozo Brotherhood. Attacking children, attacking women, attacking vulnerable people was already prohibited. As such, if any member of the Brotherhood committed such an act, he would be fined and punished within our organization. Now, when we learned more about international humanitarian law, we realized that we were already on the right track, and we raised our voices to help continue to protect people and property. In the Boucle du Moon, and the Lakosi province, and in Dozoba, we took part in a training on humanitarian law to shed light on some of the situations which we were unaware of. That's why we feel that IHL is so important, because when we received this training, it allowed our organization, our brotherhood, to raise awareness within the members of the brotherhood to the current context, and also allowed us to work together with traditional chiefs who are key figures in our region. We live in communities in Africa. We have rights, we have Sharia law within our communities, but international humanitarian law gives us more clarity, and that's why it's important for those who haven't had the experience of this training yet. We believe that other neighboring communities really need to have it. Before, we had limitations, but there were many things that we didn't know. Thanks to international humanitarian law, now we are able to understand our limits and not go beyond what is authorized.
Très bien. On passe à Madame.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to speak. When I was preparing for this session, I reached out to my colleagues to share experiences on the recruitment and use of children by armed forces and groups, and I received a heartbreaking number of examples, a sign that child recruitment and the impact on children and families is something that we don't have to look far to see. It's very present in the lives of my colleagues directly working with children in the different countries where we are present. I will start by sharing one example about Kon and his father, Peter. They are residents in Unity States in South Sudan. This is a story from 2015, 10 years ago, but it still represents what is happening to children right now. At this time, the county was under opposition control, and it was attacked by armed youth supported by government forces. Their goal was very clear: to displace the opposition, loot, and terrorize civilians. The attackers burned homes, took cattle, abused civilians, and as it always happens during such situations, children, girls, and boys and young women were abducted. Kon was then 12 years old when he was abducted. His father searched for him for months. After a while, he determined that his son was likely dead. He felt hopeless, and this went on for 3 years. While Peter grieved, the situation in the country was changing. Some of you in this room may have participated in diplomatic work and negotiations that normally lead to peace agreements. I know, or I bet, it often feels like an uphill task, but it does make a difference. In 2018, a peace agreement was signed in South Sudan. As a direct result of that, road access became improved. And so Peter was able to go and look for his son when he heard that he was in a military barrack. He managed to travel because of the access of the roads to look for his son. He took that trip with mixed emotions because he knew local commanders often operated as if they were above the law, that rights do not exist, and they were especially hostile towards abducted youth. At that time, there was no formal process for releasing children from armed groups, unless there was an emergency that existed, and then they were released or dismissed from the armed groups. So Peter negotiated, and he eventually released his son while using what you and I may call a bribe. But what is a bribe when it's the only thing that will secure the future of your child. The joy of reunion soon gave way to new challenges. As we know, when children are recruited, they face different forms of abuse that happen, and they witness a lot of atrocities. And so when Kon came back home, he had changed. He was not the same son as his parents knew him before. Outside the home, he was called names, including a murderer. This is when IRC, one of the humanitarian organizations working in this location, met Kon and Peter. Their situation was brought to us by a concerned community member. The IRC supported Kon and Peter with family-based support to ensure he was able to feel welcome at home. He was then supported to be able to go back to school as part of his reintegration. But because of the experiences that he had faced, the long time he had lost education access, and also the difficulty in terms of how to interact, and the teachers' also well-being and their interaction with children who may express some externalizing or difficult behavior, education did not work for him. He was supported with mental health services to help him recover. And this recovery journey takes time. It's not as simple as providing humanitarian aid that is short-term. It really does take time. Child protection in practice, how does it look like? It looks like working with parents and other household members to address their fears, their concerns, the stigma they face, the stigma their children face, and work to adjust their, to address the situations that they must adjust to make it easier for their child to reintegrate at home and for their child to regain their livelihood. At the same time, we provide other services, be it medical or social support, and accompany the child throughout their life as they recover. Unfortunately, in Kon's case, while he was still recovering, there was still pressure in the community for re-recruitment, and so his family had to secure his future. What his father did was to send him to a neighboring country as a refugee. This is a case of a child victim forced to become a refugee instead of receiving reparations or instead of living with his family safely. I can't help but wonder, what about his rights? We know that over 173 countries have signed the optional protocol to end recruitment. There are national action plans that have been drafted to end child recruitment. The continued recruitment and use of children in armed conflict is a clear violation of international humanitarian law, and enforcement remains weak with the lack of political will to hold perpetrators accountable. For children formerly recruited like Kon, or those yet to be released, other efforts remain fragile as the protection space continues to shrink under the weight of ongoing conflict. There's lots of impunity, and we are beginning to see also a culture, or continuing to see a culture of acceptance of child militarization. Program staff, like other panelists have said, are also facing threats and intimidation from armed actors who often refuse to release children. While there have been meaningful steps towards ending recruitment and use of children in various countries like the Congo, South Sudan, CAR, Nigeria, the gains remain fragile. As noted in the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict reports, we know that the number of girls and boys recruited is still continuing to be on the rise. This is a story of one child, one parent, one family, but it is the same story for many children in different situations. Children who become victims from birth, even before they know what international humanitarian law is, if they ever get to know what that is. And who is accountable to support them? Why is child recruitment still happening even right now when all these different conventions, Paris principles, Vancouver principles are all in place? Communities have a deep thirst for peace and stability. Parents and community members want this to end. Kon and Peter's story is an example of how parents took action themselves, an example of how communities can rally around children in need. It also reflects that support is possible, and there is life post-recruitment when humanitarian agencies are able to respond to the mental health and basic needs support of children over time. However, it also shows the lasting scars of conflict and that protecting, respecting, and fulfilling the rights of children is only possible through lasting peace, which is where governments must act and hold themselves accountable. Governments, those in conflict and those in the European Union, must respond to the evidence that tells us the cost of violence is not just linked to the cost of humanitarian services, but violence costs countries millions in their GDPs, and it creates a cyclical and intergenerational violence. Humanitarians like me come in after the story of Peter has happened. We learn from evidence to know how to do this best. But stopping what happened to Peter's son needs action from national leaders and people like you to use your power to uphold IHL. Let's give childhood and child rights a chance.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on to the discussion with members of parliament. We're going to start with the MEPs and then the DV MEPs. We have Ms. Match to begin. No, Isabella's telling me no. Yes? Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I was unable to be here at the start, but thank you for being here. Thank you for what you have shared with us. It is an exceedingly important point, and in our committee we wanted to talk about this for a very long time. So thank you as well to the President of the committee for ensuring that we are able to do this. I'm keen to hear the other questions that will be asked by my colleagues and then perhaps come back because I wasn't able to be here at the beginning. And thank you very much for the last testimony that I was able to hear. In particular, we'll give the floor to Ms. Riddell now from S&D. Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone, for your testimonies, for your recommendations, talking about international humanitarian law right now, particularly with what's going on in Gaza, where everything has been done to violate this law, where families are being targeted. This leads us to ask what is going on with international humanitarian law. It has decades of history, but how can we ensure that it continues to thrive? So we've heard many recommendations to the European Union, strengthening humanitarian diplomacy. Do you think that the European Union is doing enough where this is concerned? We also heard you encourage investment in the protection of humanitarian workers. What do you think we can do? What more can be done that the European Union isn't currently doing here? Saying that a bit euphemistically because I do understand that the European Union can do much more, but I'd be happy to hear your views on this. And finally, I'd like to bring up the question of protection of women and girls in conflict zones. 600 million women and girls live in conflict zones, and they are often the first civilian targets of these conflicts, and they suffer specific things like sexual slavery and sexual violence. And we know that the health of women and girls, their participation in community life contributes to economic development, peace. And so what would you suggest that the European Union do to better support women and girls throughout the world, their emancipation and empowerment, particularly in conflict areas? Thank you. Thank you, colleague. I am not sure of the DV speaker. Is it you, Ms. Maish? You can have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. Apologies. I think I was listening to the translation, and then I think you were giving me the floor. But thank you very much for giving me the floor, and also thank you for the people here for your introductions. I think it's super timely, and it's really a very important topic that we're talking about today, because we see the number of conflicts is rising, and as you have described, also the violations of international humanitarian law and human rights in those conflicts is rising, and somehow it seems to come to a sort of free for all, because we seem to be less compliant also from our side when it comes to working on against the violation of human rights and humanitarian law. As the colleagues also have mentioned, we see the atrocities in Gaza, which is a clear violation, and somehow there is not enough pressure also politically from the European Union. I mean, we have to draw red lines there, and somehow it doesn't seem to be possible for many political leaders to draw red lines. So I really also would like to have your reflections on how we can, from our position in the European Parliament, also pressure our political leaders and the leaders of our member states to draw red lines and to do something, because this is something that happens not only, of course, in Gaza, but also in other areas where we see that these rights are being violated. And I think it's super important also the story that you showed from the Dozo community in Burkina Faso, that there is awareness, but of course the awareness is not widespread. And we see that in some communities and in some places, if one does it, well, the other will also do it. So I think we really need to step up there and to also protect humanitarian workers, but also, as my colleague Riedel said, protect especially children and women in these contexts. We hear more and more. Yesterday we had information about some countries where women also need to pay with their bodies to get humanitarian assistance. And I think, this is really a step where which is going way too far. We know sex is used as a weapon of war, violation, rape is used as a weapon of war. But when it also is used for women to be able to get the relief that they need, I think these atrocities are really something that we need to stop. So I would like to also hear your reflections on that. Thank you very much.
Très bien, il y a personne.
Thank you very much. No one for the Patriots here, so ECR. Ms. Gosiewska, you have the floor.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you for raising this topic. Thank you for organizing this hearing and for these really intense testimonies that we've heard. But I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that the country that is a leader in terms of breaching international humanitarian law is Russia. And this is a country that has not been mentioned yet in this room, and I regret that. Russia has been violating humanitarian law, and its victim has mostly, in recent years, been the Ukrainian people. My country is Ukraine's neighbor. We support the Ukrainians in their fight, and we also support Ukraine in a humanitarian manner. We support the victims. We do have rape victims. Women have been raped by Russian soldiers. We have children who fell victim to rape as well. Kidnapped children who have been kidnapped deep into Russia, put into camps where they are being denationalized, being brainwashed, and we've also know of 2 camps where they are undergoing military training. So that means that very soon, like in the stories that we heard today, they can actually go to the front line, hold a rifle, and then fight against their own nation. I wonder if any of the organizations here actually deal with this topic. Have you visited camps where kidnapped Ukrainian children are being held? Have you attempted any activities on the international arena in order to solve this issue, in order to force Russia to release these children? Thank you very much.
Merci, chers collègues.
Thank you, colleagues. For Renew, Mr. Getter.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And thank you to our guests as well. I'd like to share my thoughts with you. What we've just heard has just strengthened what I was thinking. The major change, or perhaps I should say one of the major changes of the last couple of years, is that the United States have, under Donald Trump, completely deserted the field of defending human rights, generally speaking, and in particular in war zones. the European Union is now the only power which is advocating for defending human rights. And defending human rights is part of its identity. At the same time, the European Union is trying to stand as a political power on the international scene, and it will do so increasingly, in my view. The EU will be a more prominent player on the international scene in the future. And it is lamentable that it will not intervene as much. That's a fact. It's something we need to be aware of. In terms of defending human rights, where it should be intervening in a difficult century, where the EU should be keeping the tabs on what's going on. So what conclusion can we draw from this this double reality? A very simple conclusion, actually, and that is that within the European Union, civil society will have a more and more crucial role to play in defending human rights. And one of the three European Union institutions, our Parliament that is, will have an absolutely fundamental role to play. And that is something that we need to really do our utmost to work on, to extend, and let's not have any illusions about this. We're seeing other institutions retreat on these questions. Thank you.
Monsieur Andrews.
Thank you. Ms. Andrews?
I would like to just ask a question of Mr. Délétroz. Does he think that the European Union takes a consistent approach to international humanitarian law? As Ms. Goziewska rightly pointed out, the European Union has been explicit in its support for findings of the International Court of Justice in relation to Russia, and has explicitly supported the issuing of arrest warrants by the International Criminal Court in relation to leaders in Russia and Belarus. However, as Ms. Mai just pointed out, the European Union has not explicitly supported findings of the International Court of Justice in relation to the government of Israel and Hamas, nor has it supported the arrest warrants that have been issued as arising from that conflict. And do you agree that this has an incredibly undermining effect on international support for international humanitarian law? And do you agree that it emboldens those who seek to breach international humanitarian law and to get away with it with impunity? In the cases that Ms. Ajengo pointed out in Colombia and Burkina Faso, these are very high-profile breaches at a very high level of the European Union, not breaches, but inconsistencies. I would like him to comment on that. There is also a technical issue we are confronted with now in the European Union, where the humanitarian instrument is being merged with the development and pre-accession instrument in the context of our budget for the period 2028 to 2035. Do any of the speakers have a view about whether that's a good idea, or does it undermine the independence of humanitarian intervention, potentially undermining international humanitarian law and undermining the safety of humanitarian workers? Thank you.
Madame
Katerina, you have the floor.
Chair, also thank you for all the speakers for being here today. I'm very glad that so many of my colleagues have raised the issue of Gaza, and I don't want to go into much detail because I know this is not necessarily the expertise of the panel, but I still find it a very important point that my colleague just made, that every time we do not stick to international law, to humanitarian law, that we do not support the international courts, and every time we let impunity go by, that sends a message, regardless of where that is happening. What happens in our position towards Israel has repercussions in our future stances and our ability to protect international law in other conflicts in the world, and that makes me extremely concerned, as I think it makes many of us in this room. So as the European Union, I would agree with my colleague Marit, we need to do a lot more politically. We also need to put our money where our mouth is. We need to make sure the next MFF supports the thematic program on peace, stability and conflict prevention, and we need to support the international law courts and institutions. So to the panel more specifically, I would like to ask, in the face of the complex crises that you spoke about, whether that would be in Colombia, but also in other examples like in Haiti, in Gaza, in Congo, because of the armed groups, how can the EU effectively contribute to alleviating population distress and addressing critical humanitarian needs to ensure the implementation of compliance with international humanitarian law, while also at the same time respecting local sovereignty and ensuring long-term stability? And perhaps one question specifically on Colombia, because one of our speakers went a bit more into detail there. Petro has tried to implement a public policy of paz total. As the speaker mentioned, it's giving enough results. How can the EU, as one of the guarantors of the peace agreement, ensure compliance of this peace agreement on the territories, especially with this government? Thank you.
Alors, on a fini le tour des groupes.
Right, that's all the group speakers done. Are there any other members who would like to take the floor? You can for 1 minute, but please do keep it as brief as possible. And there will be a second panel where you will be able to take the floor as well. Mr. Tacchino. I'll be speaking in Italian. Thank you, President. First of all, let me say thank you. Thank you to all of the representatives that are here. Thank you for your reports. You have underscored a fundamental point for me, which is the non-violent point in terms of the European Union of Defence. We are really focusing on weapons and defending our rights, but there's a non-violent dimension, and you are protagonists for this, so thank you for doing that. Then also, there are some options that we've chosen, and here we're talking about anti-personnel mines and other types of weapons as well that we focused on. Now, here in this Parliament, we have approved these weapons being used again in European arsenals, and this is a really serious problem, and I will be able to speak more on these topics.
Merci. Il n'y a pas d'autres demandes.
Thank you. If there are no further requests for the floor, okay, I will give the floor to the panel to respond. 2 minutes. Please do your best so that we can go on to the second panel. It's going to be difficult in 2 minutes because there are some really important questions, and I can summarize. I think in terms of humanitarian law and what the EU can do, thank you, Mr. Guetta, for what you said. I think the work that we do on the ground is really important, very pragmatic, and a power like the EU, an international power, tries to be pragmatic. But I think the essential thing in the EU's general diplomacy and that of this Parliament, that defending humanitarian law and human rights should be supported broadly. We've grown up in many, like many of the people here, in democracies. That was our luck. In a large chamber like this, we don't expect everyone to have the same point of view, but there are some basic values which the Chamber has to agree on. And these basic values is that the EU's 27 member states are all part of the Geneva Convention. And that has to be absolutely key. We should not allow, even for a second, for this to be divided up along ideological lines. You spoke very passionately about the Ukrainian conflict, Madam. I do share your passion. I do speak the same language. I see the same things happening as you. But I think that despite how passionate we can be about this, about the Israeli-Palestinian conference, there's something that has to be absolutely key for the European Union, be it in Ukraine or Israel-Palestine or Sudan, which we haven't really mentioned. Sudan is the armed conflict that is causing the highest number of civilian casualties at the moment. When we see women being raped or children being massacred, there are videos coming out of Darfur which make it look like Auschwitz. We see armed gangs, armed to the teeth, shooting people in the head, women with their babies in their arms, fleeing. And I think we all have our political views. You can be from the left, from the right wing. You could be pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian. That's absolutely normal. It's democracy. But the day where these ideological visions prevent us as Europeans from really focusing on what we should do in our foreign policy, which is focus on fundamental values and international human rights law and humanitarian law, and finishing on what you were saying, Mr. Tarquino, the day we stop doing that, we have a problem. In all of the areas that Juan Carlos mentioned in Arauca, when we see these armed groups being better and better armed, they're not the ones making the weapons. Where are the weapons being manufactured? I come from a small country, Switzerland, but it's neutral. But in the UN, I have warned states about what is going on. All of these armed groups that Geneva Call is working with, they all have sponsors who arm them, and that's often the case that they are states. And I say, watch out, you're creating monsters. Look what's happening in Sudan. Who set up the Janjaweed, which is now called the RSF today? Some of the people that set up these groups have seen their cities being sacked. And who is responsible for this? Look what's happened in the Red Sea as well. An armed group which can suddenly jeopardize international trade with direct, immediate consequences for the EU, for China, without talking about the countries in the Red Sea basin. And Mr. Tarquino, I think that there's something to look at here. Who is supervising arms control? Small arms. It's cheaper to buy a rifle, the Kalashnikov, than it is to buy bread in some of these areas. Thank you. You do need a bit more than 2 minutes for your answer, but thank you for that reply. Mr. Vilate Camargo, Juan Carlos, would you mind answering some of the questions we've been asked? Yes, of course. I think I have to say, first off, the current government of Augusto Pietro in Colombia has tried to work on peace. And unfortunately, as I was saying, armed groups, these non-state groups, have seized this opportunity. And the non-state groups, what they've done is taken advantage of the goodwill of the government to try and reach agreements between themselves and strengthen their own structures, to weaponize, and what's happening is similar to this. These peace agreements, the idea is to try and end these conflicts. With the LNN in Ecuador a few days ago, soldiers were murdered that were part of the Colombian guerrilla forces, which shows that these structures do not want to cooperate. And given the peace agreement signed in 2016, Juan Manuel Sanchez's government brought a lot of money, but we haven't been able to implement these agreements. What this has happened is that some of the signatories to these peace agreements have actually decided to rearm due to a lack of money that has come in. And we could think that the EU could support projects. We've got these really nice peace agreements that are really nicely structured that are not being implemented on the ground or fully, and the EU could help with funding for this. Thank you.
Madame Agengo.
Ms. Agengo?
So I'll take on 3 questions, one related to women and girls and what happens in conflict zones. The question on merging instruments, I'll give my opinion, and how the EU can address critical humanitarian needs. On the issue of women and girls, I would just start by saying we know that the first experience, average girls by the age of 15 have their first experience of sexual violence or intimate partner violence or GBV, and it continues towards adulthood. This is already in any setting, not necessarily conflict settings. So put these social norms already that perpetuate gender-based violence, and then add to that the conflict situation. So already we are having communities or societies that have normalized gender-based violence, and on top of that, the burden that the conflict brings to women and girls. We know already what works. We have models and programs that look at the leadership of women-led organizations and really putting leadership or funding to these local organizations that support women-led organizations, child participation. These are ways that we can actually bring action, leadership of women and girls to address the things that they think are most important in these particular humanitarian situations. When it comes to the issue of the humanitarian development budget and merging this, my opinion is that what really matters is what is the outcome. When we have humanitarian funding, it's so short that you cannot support a child who's been recruited and has faced various atrocities for over 3 years, and then you have a budget of $40 per child to support them recover. How do you recover from that, from 3 years of childhood that has been lost? The development actors would then say they do not fund things that are humanitarian, like child recruitment. So there's that gap in between. So merging could be an idea, but then what does that merger mean? Does it result to quality services for the child? I think that's the bottom line. Whichever part the budget lies, that's absolutely fine. The last thing on what the EU can do to address critical humanitarian needs, I think we really need to think about the quality of humanitarian services. The needs are very high, the budgets are low, the zones are insecure. Community members who are addressing this who are frontline to respond to these issues are also being targeted. So I think looking at what is the quality of that humanitarian service that is being provided when these needs are so high, what is the outcome? Is it just a piecemeal service, or is it something that can actually change the life of a child? Because if we don't address this, we start seeing the continuing rise of sexual exploitation to access humanitarian aid, because the two go together. Thank you.
Merci. Ceci conclut.
Thank you. That concludes our exchange of views with the first panel. I'd like to thank you very much, and I'll give my colleague, Ms. Pagin, to introduce the second panel.
Munir. I think it's clear from the first panel and discussions that we have noted very well, incluida la demanda de... Okay, sure, sorry. Let's say goodbye to the panel. Thank you so much for your,
Juste le temps de changer le panel.
Comments. Okay, dear colleagues, I was saying that it's clear from the first panel and the discussion that we have noted very well that the challenges in ensuring compliance with international humanitarian law and international human rights law are complex and interconnected. Without further ado, I will now pass the floor to each of our panelists in the second panel to speak from their organization's specific mandate and angle to the challenges of strengthening protection and access in fragile contexts. I would like them to reflect also on the role that the European Union member states and the European Union, including Parliament specifically, can play to promote international humanitarian law and the humanitarian principles with the aim of ensuring that vulnerable civilians are effectively protected across conflict lines and that life-saving aid can reach those for whom it is needed. So I would like to now to give the floor for the panelists for 6 minutes each. The first panelist is Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham, Director of OCHA's Coordination Division and Director of OCHA's Geneva Office, who is going to be online. Please go ahead. I think that we can't hear you. I don't know if that colleagues for... Okay. Let's check the sound and then continue. Yeah, maybe we can move first to... No, because it's not working. Can you speak again? Let's try again. No, it's not working. So I think it's good, you know, to maybe to move the, yeah, I was saying that, to move the floor to the next one and then we try to repair the technical problems. Let's move now to Mrs. Christina Embach von Arx. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your last name well. Head of Humanitarian Diplomacy and International Committee of the Red Cross. Thank you for coming. Please go ahead.
Now it's good? Yes. Okay. Dear members of the European Parliament, it's really an honor to participate to this joint DEV droit hearing on advancing international humanitarian law and international human rights law in conflict zones and fragile contexts to protect the most vulnerable. We have mentioned it before, but as we speak, there are over 120 active armed conflicts raging in the world, and they're really causing unbearable suffering. We are seeing this on a daily basis when we discharge our humanitarian mission throughout the world. So this discussion and promoting the strict adherence to international humanitarian law is more urgent than ever. Protection is at the core of the ICRC mandate, and what we mean is that activities to prevent, to put an end, and to respond to the consequences of violations of IHL are at the heart of the institutional ambitions of the ICRC. So we heard before the testimonies of our colleagues, of practitioners working to strengthen compliance with IHL in challenging conditions. But we have to remind ourselves that IHL obligations, of course, rest upon parties to the conflict, but also on all states parties to the Geneva Conventions, which have the duty to respect and ensure respect for IHL. So the European Parliament plays an integral part in these efforts, including to the capacity to speak out and adopt resolutions that contain strong and precise references to IHL. It also makes contributions to building a legislative framework that supports EU member states to fulfill their IHL obligations, and its co-decision on the budget is also crucial to ensure that a strong standalone humanitarian budget in the next iteration of the multi-annual financial framework is maintained. Before moving on to contributions of what the EU Parliament can do more, I would still like to share a few observations of our concern with regard to the state of respect for IHL. The first one is a concern about this permissive interpretation of IHL. IHL is a very pragmatic set of rules. Two fundamental principles, that one of humanity and military necessity, underline and inform the entire normative framework of IHL. All rules of IHL reflect this careful balance between the two principles, which in turn inform the interpretation of these rules. Today, we are concerned about an interpretation that is permissive to the detriment of the principle of humanity. Also, other principles that are central to IHL are being put into question. This is in particular the case for the principle of non-reciprocity. That is, that the idea to respect IHL is not subordinated to whether the opposing party upholds its own obligations. Upholding this principle is essential to preserve the protective capacity of IHL. Then we are also really concerned about withdrawals from landmark humanitarian treaties. IHL has developed over time to cover emerging needs and challenges. So it is developing the Geneva Conventions, the additional protocols, the weapons treaties and customs. They are together what creates the legal frame that we have today. The signals sent by countries withdrawing from key disarmament treaties like the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention and the Convention on Cluster Munition is worrying. The human cost of cluster munition and anti-personnel mines, I think it was mentioned before, and other weapons, they are devastating. And when I look at the list of countries that are listed in the OECD report, amongst the most fragile, we see several that are conflict affected and they're dealing with legacies of weapon contamination that are still a factor of harm to the population today. It is critical to speak out for maintaining the balance between humanity and military necessity as the core idea underpinning international law, international humanitarian law. We need to preserve IHL, no matter how exceptional the circumstances are, and we should not forget that IHL was created for exceptional circumstances, which is conflict. Turning to operational matters on the humanitarian space, we are also in agreement about the concern of the restrictions. Due to the lack of understanding and respect for the fundamental principles, upholding these principles consistently is very important for an organization like the ICRC because it's what allows us to build trust, gain acceptance, and finally reach to the most vulnerable, those who are most in need, in line with our impartiality principle. This is especially important in complex and high-risk environments. The challenges and ways in which the humanitarian space comes under strain are multiple. It's on the one hand administrative, sometimes it's a matter of visas and so on, can be legal. And there I would like to open a little parenthesis and voice some appreciation for the work of the European Parliament in working towards humanitarian exemptions so that when it comes to sanctions, so that humanitarian work can continue even in difficult circumstances. Security, we have heard about the attacks on humanitarian workers. There's a lot restricting the space, but it's also the information, misinformation and harmful information about the work of the humanitarian workers can also severely restrict humanitarian space and the ability to operate. Turning on to the recommendations, I think promotion of IHL starts by setting the example domestically. As a co-legislative body, and given that members of European Parliament influence their own constituencies, they have a positive role in ensuring the implementation of IHL both at EU and national level. IHL considerations should be integrated in EU law and strategic documents such as the Directive on Sanctions to set a positive example. Whenever conflict is being discussed, including when adopting European Parliament resolutions on conflict-affected contexts, IHL and humanitarian principles should be integrated systematically to ensure consistent, coherent and principled EU approach. In addition, EU member states are not only bound to respect IHL, but also to ensure the respect for IHL rules by others. I think this has been mentioned before. And the EU has made respect for IHL a cornerstone of its external relations approach, which we appreciate, through adopting the EU guidelines on promoting compliance with IHL. They outlined an important set of tools that the EU can use to promote compliance with IHL in its relation with third countries. And we've welcomed the annual reports that are published to showcase what are the concrete efforts the EU undertakes. We further strongly encourage the EU to use its leverage whenever it has influence in virtue of its foreign policy to enhance the protection of civilians and ensure respect for IHL. The European Parliament can contribute to such efforts through the consent or consultation power with the EU when the EU adopts agreements with third countries, as well its parliamentary diplomacy with non-EU parliaments. In the interest of time, I will stop here and pass it on to the next speaker.
Thank you so much. Let me go back to Mr. Ramesh and see if we can hear him now.
Thank you, Chair. I hope you can hear me now. Great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for that. Chair, thank you again for this opportunity to be here and join you on a critical subject for all of us. One of OCHA, my offices, that's the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and our head, the Emergency Relief Coordinator's functions, is to serve as a strong advocate for international humanitarian law and the protection of civilians. And we leverage our mandate in the UN to push for this protection of civilians, including humanitarian access in complex and fragile contexts, both from the deep field checkpoint that you have with armed groups, all the way to the Security Council. And an example of this recently was our Under-Secretary General's remarks to the Council yesterday, calling for an immediate action to respect international humanitarian law, prevent genocide, and allow humanitarian aid to enter Gaza. On the ground, we are present in many crisis contexts, many conflicts, from Gaza to the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Sudan. And this allows us to engage with all parties to the conflict and others to negotiate humanitarian access and advocate for the protection of civilians. We also use our access and coordination mandates given to us by the General Assembly to mobilize our humanitarian partners around those issues and to ensure that there's coherence, effectiveness and efficiency. And an example of this is the Democratic Republic of the Congo with the M23 group, or currently with parties to the conflict in Sudan today. The Emergency Relief Coordinator and OCHA's humanitarian diplomacy efforts have also helped secure humanitarian access, raise protection issues and uphold humanitarian commitments. And an example of this is in northwest Syria, by mobilizing Security Council members to vote for a cross-border resolution in 2014, which allowed us to cross into Syria to support millions of people who are unserved and were displaced because we couldn't get access coming in through Damascus. And again, similarly, following the Syria-Turkey earthquake in February of 2023, we got through negotiations Damascus to open up those crossing points bilaterally as well. Similarly, for Sudan, during talks with the warring parties in Jeddah and in Switzerland, we've been able to get some openings in access. And at the global level, we also mobilize resources to promote the humanitarian agenda and the protection of civilians, including on context-specific issues. So I mentioned the Security Council at the beginning. In 2024, we briefed the Security Council 52 times on Gaza, the Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Yemen and Syria and other situations, providing testimony to a range of protection risks that civilians face, and emphasizing again, as my colleague Christina just mentioned, the importance of upholding international humanitarian law and human rights law. And we do so often amplifying the call to end violations, including conflict-related sexual violence against women and girls, which we have seen in the most horrific scenes in DRC and in Sudan recently. OCHA also drafts the Secretary General's recommendations on the protection of civilians in Sudan to the Security Council, together with our Department of Peacekeeping and Political Affairs, the UN Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and also we continue to engage with member states, including EU members, the UN and other partners in taking this forward. We also organize the annual Protection of Civilians Week in the margins of the Security Council's open debate on the subject, and that's a great place for this interaction. Beyond this, we engage on specific initiatives at the global level, for example, in the political declaration on the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, which we are seeing to devastating effect in places like Gaza. And this declaration is an important example where we've had excellent coordination diplomacy led by states, including, especially by EU members, in close collaboration with the UN, the ICRC and civil society. Yet, I think as previous speakers have mentioned, despite these efforts and engagement, we face an unprecedented time today where IHL and the rules-based system has been blatantly ignored and impunity is becoming more and more widespread. And this is where we believe the EU and the European Parliament has a crucial, if not critical, role to play. Throughout my decades in humanitarian work, we have always seen you and the EU members as being leaders in upholding, defending and advocating for international normative frameworks, including international humanitarian law. Today, the globe over, however, there is a perception that there is a selective approach to an interpretation of international humanitarian law and normative frameworks, and that there is a strong reluctance to criticize allies and friends when they breach these laws. And it's this inconsistent approach and application of international law that is a huge threat to the future of the rules-based system and makes it increasingly difficult for our advocacy to be effective. So your leadership through inspiration, diplomacy, political and economic pressure and cooperation to influence the behavior of all parties to conflict, including your friends, for the protection of civilians can change this significantly and bring hope to those populations who are stuck in the most terrifying situations with no one else to turn to. And so we look forward to, as OCHA, to working closely with you in this endeavour and strengthening that cooperation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much for your contribution. Let's move now to the gender perspective. We have Mrs. Sophia Kaltorp, Director of Geneva Office and Chief of the Humanitarian Action at UN Women. Please.
Thank you very much, Chair, distinguished members of Parliament, panelists, dear colleagues. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, and already, as we have heard from colleagues, the gender dimension of international law and humanitarian principles are, of course, critical in terms of upholding these. And as UN Women, we are working very closely with ICRC, with OCHA and other actors to make sure that the rights of women and girls in particular are protected and upheld. As we all know, we live in times of unprecedented global crises. As of this year, more than 308 million people across 73 countries are in dire need of humanitarian assistance. Conflict, climate-induced disasters, forced displacement, and protected emergencies are intensifying. And, as we have heard, women and girls are bearing the very brunt of these intersecting crises. In fragile and conflict-affected settings, we see across the globe how the erosion of legal protection and international humanitarian law has catastrophic consequences, especially on the lives, rights and safety of women and girls. Women human rights defenders are targeted, girls are pulled out of school, forced into marriage or left without access to healthcare and protection. And as we have heard, rape is being used as a weapon of war across conflict settings today, and it's on the rise. So just to give you a few concrete examples, in Afghanistan, we have witnessed systemic efforts by de facto authorities to erase women and girls from the social and economic life. denying them access to livelihood and education opportunities. And in Sudan, a country I myself visited just last week, the need in demand for GBV services has increased by almost 300% since the outbreak of the war in 2024. Moving to Haiti, we see how sexual violence is on the rise, especially in displacement sites. And as we have also heard from colleagues in the DRC, due to the recent escalation of crisis, health workers report an alarmed increase in sexual and gender-based violence. At the same time, often in a fragile context, we see how services for women and girls are deprioritized. This is in particular the case in the context of the ongoing humanitarian reset and the funding cuts that we are all experiencing, where constrained humanitarian access and limited resources for service providers further exacerbate protection risks for women and girls. And yet, and this is my key point, it's precisely in these moments that investing in women yields the greatest returns, building resilience, restoring dignity and strengthening the humanitarian system. Because we have heard also from our colleague in the DRC, despite challenges, women are not only victims of crisis, but they are consistently frontline responders, peace builders and leaders of the communities. And to resource women-led local organizations, I think, is the most important thing that we as an international community can do if we want to contribute to the protection of women and girls in conflict settings. So, as we have heard also from the ICRC, international humanitarian law requires that partners to armed conflict treat people without discrimination, and it also prohibits, of course, sexual violence against all persons. This means for us at UN Women to work very closely with partners to make sure that IHL compliance in diplomatic discussions, whether at the UN, regional bodies, or bilateral discussions, are prioritized. And here, as colleagues, we really think that the EU has a crucial role to play, and I would like to really stress the urgent need for enhanced, sustained and coordinated political and diplomatic engagement by the European Union, its member states and of course the Parliament. The EU has in this critical moment for multilateralism a key role to play in addressing the obstacles hindering an effective humanitarian response, and this of course includes the need to prioritize the protection of civilians as well as the safety of humanitarian aid workers. And of course the EU and its member states have been long champions of international humanitarian law and gender equality. Looking at the EU Action Plan 3, the EU's Women, Peace and Security commitment, etc. So it really, I think, positions the EU uniquely to drive progress in this critical time. And I would like to finish by urging you here at the EU to go further in 3 ways. First of all, from UN Women's perspective, to ensure that IHL violations with gender impacts are systematically monitored, condemned and addressed is key. Attacks on women and girls must never be collateral damage. Second, and this relates to my earlier point in terms of increased direct support to local women-led organizations. Local women-led organizations are those providing life-saving protection, psychosocial support and leadership in the most dangerous and unserved areas. And just to mention a survey that we at UN Women launched yesterday that indicates that almost half of the local women-led organizations that we are in contact with might have to close down within 6 months due to funding cuts. So this is extremely urgent to make sure that those on the ground, we heard in the previous panel's testimonies to that end, that they are resourced to lead and protect their communities. And then third, to protect and expand the humanitarian space is crucial, and this means to ensure that gender-responsive humanitarian action is funded, safeguarded and prioritized in increasingly politically complex environment. So just to finish by thanking you all here at UN Women. We are working every day with a wide range of partners, including within the EU to ensure that humanitarian coordination mechanisms are gender responsive and that women's voices are heard, and that the protection of women and girls is not an afterthought, but really a core, true pillar of every humanitarian response. And the EU's leadership and continued consistency in raising those perspectives is not only needed, it is indispensable. And that UN Women, we are of course here to continue this important work with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And finally, we have Mrs. Claude Mahon, Director of the International Legal Department at Médecins Sans Frontières.
Thank you, Chair. Dear member of the European Parliament, thank you for having me here and for inviting Médecins Sans Frontières to this public hearing. We said it, of course, these are very turbulent and alarming times where humanitarian aid and international humanitarian law are confronted with multiple existential threats, sustained violation and persistent impunity. The European Parliament, through this hearing and through the report on humanitarian aid in a time of public crisis, reaffirming principles for a more effective and ambitious response to humanitarian crisis carried out by the Standing Rapporteur for Humanitarian Aid, is very important to prevent IHL and principle-based humanitarian action from being lost to political interest and new warfare dynamics. On October 3rd of this year, we will, at MSF, commemorate the tragic 10th anniversary of the bombing of our trauma center in Kunduz, Afghanistan. And I honor the 42 individuals killed, including 14 MSF staff, 24 patients, and 4 caretakers. This could have constituted back then an unprecedented and isolated attack against an MSF hospital. And the United Nations Security Council 2286, which was unanimously adopted a few months later, could have provided for the effective protection of the medical mission and put an end to attack on hospitals and medical personnel. Unfortunately, I must tell you that we were wrong. We couldn't be more wrong. In the past 10 years, attacks against hospitals have marked almost every conflict, from Syria to Yemen, from Sudan and Nigeria to Myanmar, from Ukraine to Gaza. What we have witnessed and denounced seems just to have become the new normal in the conduct of hostilities. Just 10 days ago, one of our hospitals was bombed in Al Fagak in South Sudan, causing the evacuation of the medical structure as well as casualties among the patients and the medical personnel. A few weeks before, 11 medical staff were killed by the Rapid Support Forces in a clinic run by Relief International in the Zamzam camp in Sudan. The same week, in the Gaza Strip, 15 medics from the Palestinian Red Crescent Society were shot dead by the IDF. In Gaza, attacks on the medical mission over the last 20 months have occurred with unprecedented magnitude. As you probably know well, the medical mission carried out by medical structures and medical personnel benefits from a very special protection under international humanitarian law. Hospitals are actually amongst the most legally protected structures during war times, and they allow to take care of the wounded and the sick, the ones that are not or no longer participating to hostilities. These medical structures are the symbol of the crucial balance between military imperatives and humanitarian necessity, which is the very essence and the primary raison d'être of international humanitarian law. Of course, medical structures can lose this specific protection when they are used to commit acts harmful to the enemy and therefore become legitimate targets for belligerents under certain conditions, not preventing them from further respecting the principles of the conduct of hostilities. But it is today quite obvious that a few warring parties worldwide have now their own interpretation on how hospitals stop benefiting from this special protection and wrongfully instrumentalize IHL and the concept of loss of protection to the benefit of their military strategy and advantages to bomb and attack hospitals day after day under the pretense of legality. This deserves reaction. This deserves to be denounced if we don't want to see attacks repeated one after the other, if we don't want to see these hospitals becoming the battlefield of the 21st century and the grave of international humanitarian law, which was specifically created to protect them. Dear members of the European Parliament, it's crucial that you acknowledge that we are at a critical moment. Critical because attacks against medical facilities and personnel are multiplying and at an unforeseen pace, without effective accountability mechanism and leaving perpetrators unpunished. Critical because medical and humanitarian organizations are left alone with IHL regularly violated, making our work more difficult, more dangerous and less efficient. Critical because attacks against hospitals and humanitarian medical staff treating all wounded and sick with impartiality, combined with counter-terrorism legislation and narrative, which are leading to the criminalization of humanitarian workers, as well as the consequences of unprecedented funding cuts, are fueling hostile sentiments against NGOs, including in Europe. Critical because violation after violation, IHL is being eroded. Humanitarian space is shrinking absolutely everywhere, and the protection of the medical mission is but a memory in some regions of the globe. Distinguished members of the Parliament, this committee has been calling multiple times for the respect of IHL and principle-based humanitarian action, and we urge you, as co-legislator and budgetary authority, to go further and to act. We ask you to keep IHL at the forefront of the EU values and to reaffirm its importance and place it high on the EU agenda, for example, by holding focused exchange on IHL issues, and to allow and make sure that IHL prevails on domestic legislation within the European Union, including through the exemptions for counterterrorism. Ensure that humanitarian aid is always preserved and protected from becoming a tool of political influence or negotiation. Humanitarian assistance must remain needs-based, and IHL is non-negotiable and must remain at the core of humanitarian interactions. Promptly react with strong position taken in resolution on grave violation of IHL. The highest levels of the European Parliament must firmly and vocally denounce IHL violation and express their constant solidarity to humanitarian organizations and personnel under increased attacks. Facilitate an international conference or a high-level public hearing at the occasion of the 10th anniversary on Resolution 2286, acknowledging the importance of continued medical assistance in situations of conflict. Finally, I would like you also to encourage member states to participate to the ICRC global initiative to galvanize political commitment to IHL and specifically its fifth work stream devoted to achieving meaningful protection of hospitals in armed conflicts, to promote discussion and clarification by states regarding the legal alleged grey area of abuse of hospitals by parties to the conflict, and promote identification of good practices that could be proposed and endorsed by good-willing states that present themselves as effective supporters of IHL and who are championing that initiative. Members of the European Parliament, the defence and respect of IHL is not about politics. It's about the future of humanity. If we fail, if you fail, to protect IHL, then there will be no victory for anyone, but only a desert of destruction and sufferance. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your appropriate and clear messages and experience from the field, and also for your requests and recommendations are very important for us. Okay, before we open the discussion, I want to mention that we also have Mrs. Joanna Darmanin, Head of the Unit on Humanitarian Aid Policies and International Humanitarian Law in DG ECHO in the room. Mrs. Darmanin, welcome to you as well, and thank you for being here today. Okay, let's now give the floor to my colleagues. Please, first of all, Vice Admiral Lima.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all of you for being here, for defending what you defend. Je vais parler en français.
I'll speak French. We're very good at reporting and calling on people to do better. And I think that we're also good at helping after the problem has already occurred. But we're not as good at protecting. Often we don't manage to prevent things from happening even on our own continent, and that must change. Now, another important point, and you brought this up, is growing impunity. We also have a lot of difficulty imposing consequences in the aftermath. and there's increasing mistrust in international law and the institutions themselves, and that leads to a lack of involvement. And so what I would like to know is, how do you see this international law evolving so it's no longer the strongest making all the rules? You've called upon countries, some specific countries, and I think that some of these places are where the change really has to take place. Somebody talked about the political and economic pressure that we must bring to bear, and I agree with that. We have this problem that exists in democratic places. When we see, for instance, that decades later we still don't have a Mercosur agreement with the European Union, while China is currently meeting and drawing up contracts to do business with all of these South American countries. It seems to me that we must also work harder to ensure that we have relations that allow international relations that make us stronger as a European Union and as a democratic region. Perhaps some of you can give examples to show the excellent work that has been done, and that might be the exemplary work for future work, a more effective future work. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Sr. Presidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Questions of international humanitarian law and humanitarian aid are moral issues, and that's the way that they should be put on the policy agenda. And this is what we've heard just now from the panel. If we look at what's happening in certain countries in terms of women and girls, what's happening to them, and the disruption of doctors' activity who are carrying out their work in the most dramatic circumstances we can imagine, that calls out to our conscience, not just individually, but also as members of the European Parliament and members of what we would consider a type of a European civilization, although you could discuss this, which respects the principle of the universal nature of human rights. And we need to act wherever human rights are in question. What we're seeing now is that in the world today, we're seeing recent behavior of the US administration having an effect. It's isolating Europe in the world, but also increases our own responsibility. We have to be up to the task of the values that that we respect. And if we do not get it right, if we're not permanently there to support everybody in the most tragic circumstances, there's different places in the world who are fighting for their most basic human rights. In these circumstances, we're talking here about human rights. It's quite abstract, but we're not daily faced with the situations that we're hearing today in Sudan, Afghanistan, Gaza, Ukraine, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it's absolutely unacceptable. It calls into question all the basic values for human civilization, generally speaking. Rather than asking a question, I just wanted to show our solidarity from the European Parliament and from the S&D Group in particular towards your activity, and to tell you that we have to live up to our responsibilities. This is why these meetings are so important, which is why it's crucial that you come here and raise these questions, which are moral questions and have to we have to prioritise over any kind of political deals or activities. Ms. Gowsiewska.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much. Among the panelists, we have a person from the International Red Cross, which makes me very happy because I do have a few questions that I have asked to this organization multiple times, also when I was Deputy Speaker of the Polish Parliament. What I mean is support for the victims of the brutal actions of the Russians in Ukraine. We have people who have been imprisoned and tortured. This is something that has been taking place since 2014. I'd like to remind you, I'm not even mentioning the tortures and the dramatic situation. We have large-scale kidnapping of children and them being deported deep into Russian territory. I'd like to know, what do you do about these things? What do you do in order to support these victims? Victims, their families who fight for their family members, and Ukrainian NGOs are telling me that it's actually nothing. That is similar with regard to Belarus and the political prisoners in this country. So I'd like to hear more details about your involvement. But also I'd like to hear from you, when are you going to finally exclude the Russian Red Cross from your international structures? We have heard multiple times that the Russian Red Cross is involved in a war. It is involved in the mobilization campaign in the country, and also involved in brainwashing and military training for kidnapped Ukrainian children. There are people from the management of the Russian Red Cross involved in these activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Andrews, please.
Yeah, thank you, Lara. So it was for the ICRC. The last question demonstrates the challenge that you have to maintain humanitarian principles of being on both sides. You know, and I sympathise with that. Nevertheless, the visit of your Secretary General to Moscow last year obviously carries the risk of being misinterpreted. The meeting with Mr. Lavrov and Ms. Bolyarich, you know, and it's, you know, when members of the public donate funds to, as they did very much in the early part of the war, they donate funds to support the humanitarian effort in Ukraine. Is it difficult for you to explain to members of the public that you are obliged to be on both sides? I think people donate money thinking they're supporting one side and not the other. So look, that's just a point. It really underlines the stress of it. Just on UN Women, this is an issue on the development side rather than humanitarian, which I know we're talking about, but our development budget carries a gender marker. However, the Commission, I think, are proposing to drop this for the next MFF from 2028. I'm not sure that sort of proposal is in circulation. Certainly there's nothing on paper yet, but it would be obviously a very negative step back, especially considering USAID are pulling out of gender, all of the UN agencies, and possibly EU is not interested in backfilling any of the support there. And finally, just in relation to MSF, you know, you mentioned the attack on Kunduz in Afghanistan and the impunity that has followed. There's never been an independent investigation of that assault on a hospital, on an MSF hospital. And equally, we have had the attack on 15 health staff in Gaza recently, the killing of 15 health staff in Gaza recently, with no investigation of that. So it really just underlines that so little progress has been made. Just a technical question, has MSF changed its risk appetite given the deterioration of the protection of international humanitarian law? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me now give the floor to Mrs. Joanna Darmanin from the Commission. When they come.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me and for the interesting discussion and for keeping the spotlight on this important issue. So thank you very much, Madam Honourable MEP. I think all speakers have said it before. What we are seeing today is an unprecedented situation. Never before have we seen the basic rules of IHL so blatantly disrespected and put into question. We've heard about the challenges in terms of constrained access, attacks against humanitarian workers, children, schools, attacks on hospitals and healthcare. And I would like to salute all those speakers and the organizations and workers that you represent for staying and delivering despite this dramatic situation. We also see that the violations of IHL come at a great cost. So the more violations you have, there is an increase of humanitarian needs, which are extremely worrying because we are also seeing an extremely stretched humanitarian system. So there are the short-term impacts, but also I think what was said this morning, there are also the longer-term impacts of violations of IHL. They affect the long-term development and peace prospects, and it's also a challenge to the rules-based international order. So these are things that certainly are of great concern to the European Union, and the respect for IHL has been a long-term priority. We have a number of tools at our disposal. We've mentioned advocacy at the highest level. You saw last week a joint statement by HR VP Callas, Commissioner Labib and Sucha on the situation in Gaza. We have our funding and cooperation with various organizations, but I agree that in the current context, we need to elevate further IHL as a political priority. So I would resonate and reinforce a number of messages that we've heard today. We have to further boost our humanitarian diplomacy efforts and ensure that we can effectively use the different tools that we have in order to support IHL. You heard yesterday Commissioner Labib was in the DEVA committee, where she also committed on this work stream to boost humanitarian diplomacy efforts. And the hours of discussion today, I think, helped also to feed into the reflections that are currently ongoing. There is the upcoming European Humanitarian Forum next week, where we will be discussing also this key element of humanitarian diplomacy, and the chair of the DEVA committee will also be on one of the dedicated panels on humanitarian diplomacy, so very much looking forward to that. Again, for our humanitarian diplomacy efforts to be effective, we need to continue to ensuring a principled approach, and I think the point just made by MEP Andrews highlights how difficult it is in a complex context to continue to take a principled approach. And we have to keep also a separate track for engagement on humanitarian issues in complex settings. I think we've heard about the issues of the principles of impartiality, neutrality, and how important they are. We also need to rely on data and analysis, and also the issue that we see about how often information is misused and also used against humanitarian workers, which is also of key concern. And also, I think a third issue that is important for us is to continue to also invest in prevention. So we are always there to try and see what we are going to do once there has been a breach of international humanitarian law. So let's try and invest more in prevention. And there we have a programmatic partnership with ICRC that focuses specifically on capacity building and trying to prevent IHL violations before they occur. I think what we are all seeing today is that in the current context of funding cuts, it is key that we ensure that we have sufficient funding for the promotion of IHL and the protection of civilians in armed conflict. We are, for example, funding several projects aimed to address gaps in terms of monitoring of IHL violations. And next week in the EHF, there will be also discussions around the IHL in Focus initiative, which again speaks to the evolution in terms of conflict and IHL. But also we need to continue to reinforce our efforts on evidence-based advocacy, data collection, and also strengthening monitoring standards. I think all of this speaks to the issue of accountability, which has come out very strongly, in particular in the last panel. Specific focus should also remain high on the agenda in terms of engagement with non-state armed actors, and there thank you for also the commitments by Geneva Call, who are an implementing partner for DG ECHO and provide a useful example in terms of what we can do concretely in an operational sense. We also fund the innovative initiative to protect aid workers. I think you've heard of this project that is funded by DG ECHO, which is this rapid response mechanism for aid workers and their immediate families who have been subject to critical incidents. And there also I had the issue of legal assistance, which is something that indeed may be useful exploring. One brief word on children. We heard a lot in the first session in particular on the impact of children, and their humanitarian funding a lot of humanitarian funding goes in terms of meeting the specific needs of children, but also last year the EU updated its guidelines on children and armed conflict, where you have stronger elements of diplomacy to make sure that the EU continues to buttress its commitment to children and armed conflicts. And on gender, yes, indeed, a key concern also for the EU, where we continue to give funding in terms of survivors of sexual violence, but also to ensure that, for example, through our gender marker, that all our projects have the gender dimension that are mainstreamed throughout our operations. Fundamentally, I guess a key point for us is that it is important that the EU continues to put funding on IHL and protection, and there certainly the European Parliament is a key ally in this endeavour. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much. I would like to take the opportunity to ask how should we use our tools of parliamentary diplomacy and also the humanitarian diplomacy from the Commission to ensure the humanitarian aid access in contexts as Gaza, for example. So now I give the floor to the panelists to respond to the questions for 2 minutes, please.
I would like to start with responding to your questions. Two, because you raised about the impunity. I think it's very important, but we should also really think about what can be done to create a culture of compliance. And I think that is an area that should not be overlooked, because it's the investment to the future. And that is very important. And it was mentioned our initiative, the global initiative on strengthening IHL. And there are 4 of the 7 work streams tackle prevention. And just last week we had one consultation on the national IHL committees, for example. They're very important. And they came very prepared. And you can see that there's a big potential also to contribute to this culture of compliance, because in IHL committees there are several ministries that are joining the efforts to ensure that IHL can be respected, because it will need many different contributions. You ask about good practices. You know, sometimes it's, or good examples from protection. It's sometimes difficult. It can be a slippery slope, because we don't want to give the impression that everything is going well, you know, when actually it is not. And yes, there are sometimes good examples in our bilateral dialogue. Of course, we try to make a careful balance. But for example, on the protection of the medical mission, we heard today Colombia, I think it's one of the countries that has advanced a lot in the legal framework, in the consciousness, in making the problem visible and understood, and also training the staff. So it's there are a few very good examples where we see positive impact, but there are so many other examples that are so worrying that we really don't want to give the impression that the state is good when it comes to the protection of the medical mission. But that, I think, would be something that I would like to share. With regard to the question on Ukraine and the children and the detainees, we understand the difficulties, especially when it comes to the children, because the children are amongst the most vulnerable. However, when it comes to how we engage, we depend on what we can do with the authorities. We cannot force our way in. We cannot force our way into a detention center. It's a common question, but we do depend on dialogue with the authorities to ensure that our access is granted and that our recommendations are understood. That is how the ICRC operates, and especially for the detention, I would like to convey this message. On the children, it's even slightly a bit more complicated because it's a very heterogeneous group. It's numbers that it's not an agreement, and we need to look into every single case by case, individually, which takes time, but the ICRC has taken action, especially in cases where there has been a mediation process. And then maybe one last, just an information.
Much time, sorry.
Okay. Yes, I leave it there. I pass on.
No, we're going to first to go to online because I remember that we have
yes.
Mr. Ramesh online.
Hello, Chair. Can you hear me clearly?
Please go ahead.
Thanks very much. Yes, thanks very much. I think there's a wealth of good practice to protect civilians in line with and going beyond the law. And there are dozens of recommendations that we have had in successive Secretary General's reports on the protection of civilians in this regard. And this deserves more attention from member states, including the EU. So I think, and all these recommendations come from experiences that we've seen in the field and how can we improve the application of the law. Some good practices also include, for instance, the signing and encouraging parties to sign the UN Protection of Civilians Action Plans, for example, on children in armed conflict, the political declaration on the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, or initiatives that engage non-state armed groups to strengthen the protection of civilians, such as the Geneva Call deeds of commitment to respect specific rules, which Mr. Délétroz was speaking about earlier on, such as ending the recruitment of children or protecting healthcare. Another way is to continue to channel EU funding through trusted and principled humanitarian organizations and the UN coordinated system. By contrast with initiatives that present themselves as humanitarian while disregarding our principles. So in this case, obviously, the assistance modalities that the government of Israel would like to impose right now on Gaza. So our system is not perfect. We can always improve. But the UN coordinated humanitarian system and the humanitarian organizations that the EU and ECHO has been working with so far are entirely committed to these principles. So it does mean a degree of flexibility in financing, etc. And then finally, those humanitarian exemptions that the EU has introduced across all its sanctions regimes following the adoption of the UN Security Council Resolution 2664, this serves as a model for well-crafted humanitarian exemptions, which translates this tolerance for humanitarian action into funding policies, which is essential. At the end of the day, I think international law, international humanitarian law, these are all robust normative frameworks. But as Christina and others have also mentioned, it really is the application of these laws and the accountability that we should hold others to. We have the frameworks for accountability. We have the ICC, we have the ICJ. But somehow when they come up with decisions, etc., they are selectively chosen. So how do we consistently use these frameworks to ensure that they are applied and there's accountability? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. Just to let you know that we have only 5 minutes for the room, so please.
Thank you very much. I will be brief and address the specific questions addressed to me on the gender marker, because that was actually, honourable parliamentarian, news to me. That there were possible proposals to drop the EU gender marker. I mean, just to be extremely clear, the gender marker and specifically the incredible work that's been done by the EU has been incredible. And I think to drop the gender marker would be a big mistake, not only because that would mean less protection for women and girls, but, and I mean, in those times of financial constraint, all research shows that investing in women and girls is the most efficient way to do development. As an example, we have, together with OCHA, done a study showcasing that every dollar invested in a gender-sensitive humanitarian program has an $8 return on that investment. So investing in gender equality, using gender markers is not only the right thing to do, but very much the smart thing to do. Of course, at the same time, and very interesting to hear ECHO's important work and how you work with gender equality, and we're, of course, very happy to partner with you. I think we cannot forget, although we have the gender markers, to have the specific protection programs for women and girls. And there, as has been mentioned by ECHO, the point on data and analysis is really key. I mean, I've been in this business for a long time, and we have talked about mainstreaming for years and years, but it's quite interesting and actually quite sad to see that we also need very much to have specific interventions, and in order to do that we need to have the data and analysis. There are still too many humanitarian partners that do not use sex and gender disaggregated data systematically, and there, as UN Women, we are proud of partnering with WFP and others to really make sure that sex and gender analysis is part and parcel of the programs. That is not happening automatically. So I think really to fund specific intervention on data, on gender data and analysis, in addition to the gender markers, would be my very strong recommendation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Final, please.
Merci. Moi, je terminerai aussi en adressant.
Thank you. I will also finish by asking about the question on rape and the market and all that. Now, targeting hospitals has always existed. We see a dramatic increase in this, but I would like to go back to the example that I mentioned at the beginning of my speech, the hospital that was bombed in Kunduz 10 years ago. It wasn't bombed by the Afghan army or an armed group. It was by a coalition led by the American government that killed many people, including members of Médecins Sans Frontières. It wasn't the U.S. of Donald Trump. It was Barack Obama's United States. So it's important that we remember this. And remember that a great deal of work was done at the time. There was American recognition of this action. We've not gone to an international court to get this. It was through humanitarian dialogue. We were able to talk to bodies that were able to give us guarantees for the future, and that was maintained. And following that, we were able to have this resolution voted in the UN Security Council, and it's a council that will be 10 years old soon. And at the time, it was something that seemed to have worked, but 10 years later, it seems that that's not the case. And so we still have work to do. But there's something that I'm very disappointed about, and it's the fact that we're in a difficult time, a very complex time. Now we need international humanitarian law more than ever, because war is at Europe's doorstep, and it's also at the doorstep of other areas. And this is the time where this body of law must be fought for. I'd like to remind you all that this is a gift that we have. It's something that was voted on by most of the world. It is the most ratified legal instrument in the world beyond the Geneva Convention. Why? Because it was ratified in the 40s at a time when we didn't want to ever experience this sort of thing again. And unfortunately, never again. It's something that is louder now than ever. It's all of our responsibility, humanitarian organizations, the CICR, the IRC, the European Parliament, other bodies, it's now more than ever that we have to protect humanitarian law because it's protecting you and ourselves.
Contributions. Now let me pass the floor to my co-chair for his concluding thoughts.
Que dire après des mots si forts?
What can be said after such strong words? And you're right. I think that we have to be up to the task of ensuring that this never again happens. For us as a European Parliament, respect for international law comes from treaties. It's the expression of European values and of our identity as Europeans. Since I have the floor, I'd like to take advantage of this opportunity to thank you, to thank all of those who spoke today, and through you, thank all of the others who were unable to come here to speak today, because sometimes this seems like an abstract discussion among us. But for you, this isn't abstract. This is something that you risk your lives for. The respect for international law is something that we have to do everything politically, diplomatically, legally speaking, to uphold, because we have to protect you. Those who work on the ground, protecting you is protecting international law and international humanitarian law in particular. We've never needed this more than we do today.
Okay, so with all this discussion, we close the session. Thank you to all of you for your contributions, for the discussion. So have a good day.